Today we're going to go over selecting a rose for the desert. The first thing that you're going to want to decide when selecting a rose is where you want to plant the rose in your yard. Now, if you live in an HOA, please be aware that you may not be able to plant a rose in your front yard. You will need to check with the HOA. Now, if you're lucky and you're like me, we do not have an HOA, we can basically plant the rose wherever we would like. Roses are happiest if they get at least half a day of sun. A majority of my roses are on the south side of my backyard, and they get basically full sun all day, 120 degrees or not. They do quite well here. And in fact, I also have some climbers that grow on my western facing wall, and they also do very well. So I would look for a very sunny spot. I do have some roses that get a little bit more shade, and they do fine. They still get sun, but they do fine with the shade. However, they don't take off as early in the season, and then I end up getting fewer bloom cycles out of them. So that's just something to keep in mind when you are selecting a spot in your yard. So once you pick the spot in your yard, it will help if you kind of envision what you would like the bush to look like in that spot. There are many different types of roses, and to have an idea of what you want for that spot will help narrow down and help you select the type of rose that you should get for your yard. You're also going to want to take measurements and see how big of a space that you have and how big you want the rose to be. There are many different types, and they come in many different sizes, so you'll want to make sure that you're getting the correct size rose for you in your space. So if you are in Wickenburg, Phoenix, Casa Grande, Tucson, and the area southwest into Yuma, this is the USDA Hardiness Zone 9. If you are going to purchase a rose and you walk into a local nursery, they're typically only going to have a selection that's going to grow in your area. However, if you are looking for roses online or looking at specific growers and researching roses, you do want to make sure that the rose is going to grow in your area. And again, here in the desert, in the Phoenix, Tucson, Sonoran Desert, it's going to be USDA Hardiness Zone 9. In Zone 9, the planting time is in January for bare root roses, and late February, March, and early April for container roses. So you do want to keep that in mind. We can select obviously at any time of the year, but we won't be ready to plant until January into April. So like I said before, there are many different types of roses, and today I want to go over some of the more common roses that you'll find, that being the knockout roses, mini/groundcover roses, climbing roses, and what I'm going to call traditional roses. Knockout roses are one of the most popular roses sold here in America. They are advertised as being maintenance-free and disease-free. They are a very shrubby or bushy type of rose. So they're very bushy, and then they will be carpeted or blanketed in blooms. They are repeat flowering, and they will typically tend to have, tend to be covered in flowers almost all year round. And again, they're very hardy. There's as disease and maintenance free as a rose is going to get. So it's a very beautiful rose. Because it's so dense and shrub-like, they do make very good hedge roses. They tend to be 3 or 4 feet tall and wide, so keep that in mind. Now they are, if you're getting a knockout, the knockout rose is probably going to be the single rose. So this single rose means that it's just going to have one row of petals, and it's going to look like a very common flower. They also have the double knockout rose. So this has, instead of being the single, it has a double row of petals, giving it more of a traditional rose look. However, these are not going to be your traditional shaped roses. They're going to be more more flowery in nature. They also don't have any they're really not very fragrant. So if you're looking for a traditional looking rose with beautiful fragrance, this wouldn't be the type of rose for you. However, if you do want just a very colorful, very beautiful, lush green, dense plant or flowering plant for your backyard, then this might be a very, very good option for you. The next category that I wanted to talk about is mini roses / ground cover roses. So these roses perform very similarly to the knockout roses in that they will be covered by flowers. They tend to be very disease-free and maintenance-free. However, they don't have that traditional look, that traditional rose look to them. They are small, they're mini or ground cover, so they tend to stay small or low to the floor. So if you need a border plant, a nice colorful border plant in your garden, or if you have a bare spot, a bare piece of soil in your yard that you want to cover with beautiful blooms, I would definitely suggest getting a mini or ground cover rose. I do like these roses. I think that they bring a lot of color and visual interest lower to the ground. So I do like them. Next on the list are climbers. So climbers tend to have very long canes. They can be up to 10 to 12 feet long, and you can train these canes on a trellis or on an arbor or pergola or archway, and they will fill whatever structure that you train them on. It will be covered in beautiful blooms. Now, they're called climbers, not vines. A vine, when it grows, it'll intertwine on itself to give it support as it grows up a structure. These are more rambling shoots, and you, the gardener, you have to train them to have the look and shape that you want. So remember that these are roses and they do have thorns. So in order to, get them to where you want and shape them and twist them and get them to do what you need, you may experience some cuts along the way. So I think out of all of the types of roses, these are probably the hardest to maintain or to train to get what you want. However, they are stunning once they bloom, because they will just cover whatever it is that they're growing on in full of blooms, because they're very large, very 10 feet tall, 10 feet wide, very large, and they will just be covered in these beautiful blooms. Climbers do have they do come in the traditional rose shape, and they come in a variety of scents and colors. So unlike the knockout roses, they will be covered in traditional rose buds and blooms. Very beautiful. So the last category that I want to talk about is what I'm calling the traditional roses. So in this category, there's more categories or more types. They are Floribundas, hybrid teas, and Grandifloras. Yes, I know, more categories of roses, but they are labeled and marked this way. When you go to the nursery, they are going to say this is a Floribunda or this is a hybrid tea. And so if you know a little bit about what that means, it will help you select the appropriate rose for the space that you want to plant it in. They do all have different characteristics and different growth patterns and habits, so it does you do want to know a little bit about each type of rose if you're going to go into the nursery and select a rose. So the first subtype of the traditional rose is Floribundas. So Floribundas, out of all three of the traditional roses, they tend to be the shortest. It will depend on the individual rose, but in general in this category, Floribundas tend to be shorter, typically 3 to 4 feet is very typical. So when the Floribundas bloom, they will bloom in clusters, in very, very beautiful clusters of flowers, and they will bloom, these clusters will bloom at different times on the rose, so it's almost always going to be blooming, or it's always going to always have a different show of blooms on the rose. This may be my favorite type of rose, maybe. I love how they bloom in these beautiful clusters, and I love how they're always blooming and they're always in different stages of blooming. I think it's very beautiful. The next type or subtype is the hybrid tea. So the hybrid tea is the most traditional and probably the most well-known. If you were to think of a rose, you are most likely thinking of the hybrid tea. So the hybrid tea will have really long canes, and then they will tend to only have one bloom at the end of the cane. So this makes it an ideal cut rose. The hybrid teas tend to be a bit taller than the Floribundas. They can get up to 5, even 6 feet tall, and maybe like 4 feet wide. So if you want a nice big bush with like a very traditional high-centered rose, the hybrid tea is very good. So the hybrid teas, they make very good cut flowers, but they do tend to bloom in flushes. So what happens is the entire plant will put on buds, and then it will bloom basically all at the same time. So you'll have this beautiful showing of flowers, just beautiful bush covered in flowers, and then they will the rose blooms will be spent, and then it will not have roses for a period of time, and then it will bloom in another flush. So if you do not want to have a bush without any flowers on it for a period of time, then you may want to try the Floribunda. However, the hybrid teas are quite beautiful when they bloom, and they do have very beautiful classic flowers. So the last subtype is the Grandiflora. The Grandiflora is a mix between the hybrid tea and the Floribunda. So like the Floribunda, it blooms in big clusters, in large clusters, and like the hybrid tea, it tends to bloom in flushes. So you'll have a very, very big, beautiful bush covered in clusters of roses. It's very gorgeous. The Grandiflora does tend to be the largest of all 3 of the traditional rose types. So that would be 5, maybe even 6 feet. So if you would like a very large bush with very, very showy flowers, this would be a very good option. So some things to keep in mind when you are selecting a rose is the size of the bush. You do want to make sure that the rose is going to grow to be the size that you need it to be. Individual roses will grow to be different sizes. If you do a Google of the specific rose that you are looking at, Google should be able to tell you how tall and how wide the bush will grow. So that is something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that roses will have and do come in a variety of colors. Clearly this is all going to be personal preference, but do keep in mind that in selecting the color of the rose is that sometimes roses will, especially if they're multicolored roses and they have different colors throughout the rose, they tend to turn a different color, maybe depending on the type of year, how hot it is, how much sun it's getting. So it may not look exactly like the packaging. If you are getting just a solid color rose, it will tend to look more like the packaging, but the bicolor roses and the multicolored roses, they have a tendency to fade or to change color throughout the year. So just be aware of that. You can see my Floribunda behind me. These roses up here, they have been in bloom longer, and so they do fade. And these roses down here, they are new, so they are a bright new shade of orange. So just be aware that the colors do fade and do change depending on the temperature, and I think it makes them gives them more character, but be aware. Another thing to keep in mind is the bloom size and shape. So roses will have different size blooms. They can be small to medium to large. So if you're really looking for a specific, a very large flower, then get the large size bloom. A big thing to pay attention to is the number of petals on the rose. So if it says that it's a single rose, that means that it's only going to have the single row of flowers on it, and it's going to look more like just a regular flower. If it says that it has double or fully double flowers, that means that it's going to look like that traditional iconic rose type. So if you want the most traditional rose, get a fully double rose. Now, if it says that it has a large number of petals, or it's got a petal count, or it says like 40 plus petals, then it's probably going to look very full, and it's going to look more like a traditional English rose. The last thing that I would suggest considering when selecting a rose is fragrance. So no, not all roses are fragrant, and in fact, as many colors as there are roses is probably as many fragrances as there are roses. So they can range anywhere from a clove smell or a very traditional rose smell, anywhere to light and fruity and sweet. So it will depend. So I really hope that this video helped you select a rose and get the perfect rose for your desert yard. I will put out a video that shows how to plant roses, so stay tuned for that, and until next time, I will talk to you later. Bye!